Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. Rose Walker was one of those people whom everyone knew and respected. She was in her 90s, but she kept her spirits up and lived alone in a small house she had once built with her husband, Thomas. Within its walls, albeit with half-dried wallpaper, still hovered memories of better times, of a life together, full of struggle and hope. Rosa had been through a lot, a youth shattered by racial hatred, years of discrimination and universal contempt, but she had never become bitter. On the contrary, through this journey, she became a light for others. Every morning when she went outside, neighbors waved to her. Children chasing a ball always ran to hug Grandma Rosa, because she knew how to cheer up even the most fidgety. Rosa was neither rich nor powerful, but she was respected for her stamina and fortitude. Today Rosa decided to go to the little grocery store on the street corner that had been owned by the Barker family for many decades. It had once been run by an old man named Henry Barker, a grumpy but tolerant man. His groceries were expensive, but of high quality, and Rose remembered how Henry had once grudgingly sold her bread on credit when she was short of money. After his death, the store had passed to his son and then to his grandson, a young man named Jack Barker, in whom Rosa could vaguely see shadows of Henry, but something dark, cold in him, as if the family had passed on not only a commercial streak but also an oppressive disease. Jack was just over 20, but he already seemed cynical and burned out. He disliked his job and often treated customers with deliberate coldness, especially those who were not his type. He had a different attitude toward each customer, but when someone non-white or someone Jack considered beneath him entered the store, he became openly rude. The locals had grown accustomed to his manner of speaking and his haughty look. Many people forgave him for it, writing it off to his youth and assuming that one day he would realize that rudeness was not the way to a bright future. Jack didn't notice it, or perhaps he didn't care. His family thought they deserved more, that this store was not the limit, but until they dared to sell it, Jack didn't think about what he was becoming in the eyes of his neighbors. To him, they were just customers, not people, each with their own story and pain. When she arrived at the door of the store that day, she already sensed something wrong. She'd never had to deal with Jack before. His shifts rarely coincided with her visits. Usually, when Rosa went shopping, it was the young cashiers or employees who helped her, and she found it easy to get along with them. But when she opened the door and saw a scowling, contemptuous-looking guy behind the counter, with wisps of red hair, a tired look, and an almost mocking smile, Rosa experienced a disturbing internal alarm. She sensed that this young man would not look at her the way he did at his normal customers. Her eyes met his gaze, and she saw something icy, almost frightening in his eyes that made her freeze for a moment. But like a woman who'd held her head high all her life, Rose took a deep breath, remembering how she'd survived the worst situations. After all, it was just a trip to the store, just a purchase. But Jack Barker thought otherwise. Rosa cautiously entered the store and looked around, her gaze habitually lingering on the shelves of basic necessities. The elderly woman was modest, and bought mostly the essentials, some fresh vegetables, milk, cereals. With her small pension, every penny mattered, and she could not afford unnecessary expenses. Usually, the store employees helped her with her choice and even accompanied her to the exit if she had a hard time carrying her bags. Rose took a step toward the counter and smiled uncertainly at Jack, expecting the young man to be at least polite, if not as polite as the rest of the staff. She was used to being treated with respect as she got older, but Jack met her with an indifferent look, and then quickly lowered his eyes to the phone he held in his hand, displaying complete indifference. "Hello, young man," she began politely, hoping to make some sort of contact. "I'd like to. What do you want?" He cut her off, not even lifting his head from the phone. His voice was skeptical, almost mocking, as if her request already irritated him. Rose was confused, but pulled herself together and quietly continued, "I need some milk and, if you can, a couple of fresh vegetables. I can't see very well, you know." Without letting her finish, Jack dropped it, milk on the bottom shelf, vegetables there. He nodded toward the far corner. "Go get what you need, but quickly, I don't have time." Rose froze, stunned by his tone, his cold and almost hostile manner. She was used to having someone help her when she failed, but Jack was clearly not going to waste any time or energy on her. She paused, glancing at him, hoping he'd do something to correct her manner, but Jack didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on the phone, his lips curved in an impatient grin. "I'm sorry, but I just can't see very well. It would be easier for me if you helped me choose," Rosa said softly, trying to maintain her dignity and not show offense, like the rest of the staff did. As if offended by her request, Jack finally pulled away from the phone and stared at her with cold derision. "Look, Grandma, this isn't a restaurant to tell you where to go. Either get what you want on your own or find somewhere else. I don't have to serve you the way you like." His words cut at her heart like a knife. Rose felt resentment rise to her throat, but she held back, not allowing herself to show weakness. Memories of her youth, of times when she had faced outright hatred, flashed before her eyes, but now it was a different century, a different city, and it seemed that times had changed. After all she'd been through, could anyone openly humiliate her because of the color of her skin, because of her age? But there was a contempt in Jack's eyes that was impossible to ignore. He was almost sneering as he looked at her, as if to say, "You're nobody here, and you don't belong in this store." Rose felt her hands begin to tremble, but she clenched her fingers to hold back the weakness. "I'm sorry, but that's disrespectful. I'm just asking." Jack grinned, interrupting her. "Look, Grandma, don't make a scene here, okay? I have a job, not a nursing home. If you don't like something, it's not my problem. Come on, hurry up." Those words, spoken so cynically and coldly, seemed to push Rosa. She took a step back, as if trying to regain her balance. Several shoppers, who were standing at a distance and watching the scene in surprise, began to listen to her. One of the men squinted, and a young girl standing near the cash register covered her mouth with her palm, amazed at the tone. Jack, noticing the stares of those around him, only snorted contemptuously. He was sure that his family would support him, that there was nothing wrong with his behavior. He believed that this store and its owners were above gossip and judgment, that no one could tell them how to treat those they considered outsiders. Rose stood motionless, her heart pounding frantically and a feeling of bitterness and humiliation growing in her chest that she was experiencing for the first time in years. She stood in the store, feeling her hands shaking a little with resentment and confusion. She had been going to the store for so many years, had known the employees, even if only in passing, but she had always received the respect and simple help she could get. It had never occurred to her that one day she might be humiliated like this and shown that she was superfluous. She looked at Jack again, young, self-assured, with a look of cold indifference on her face. He seemed to have made up his mind about her, as if her presence in itself was already unpleasant to him, as if she were a stranger, and it irritated him to the core. At last Rose gathered her courage and tried to speak to him again, trying not to show the pain and resentment he had already caused her. "Look, young man, I don't understand why you're talking to me like that. All I'm asking is for help with my shopping. I come here often, and they've always helped me before." "Made it clear," Jack interrupted rudely, raising his voice so that everyone around him could hear it. "Go to another store if you don't like it. I don't have to serve you here." He looked her squarely in the eye with defiance, as if he expected her to give up and leave at any moment. His gaze was a mixture of anger and contempt, showing her that she was nothing to him, just an old black woman, not worthy of his attention or help. Rose tried to say something again, but Jack defiantly turned his back on her and pretended to be busy at the cash register. At that moment there was silence in the store. A couple of shoppers stopped, not hiding their surprise and embarrassment, and some, on the contrary, kept walking between the shelves, glancing furtively at Rose and Jack, as if trying not to get involved in what was happening, but still being witnesses. No one dared to approach, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone realized in an instant that there was more going on than just a denial of service. "You mean I can't buy groceries here?" Rosa finally asked quietly but firmly, gathering all her dignity. Her voice was calm, but she couldn't hide the pain and confusion that lurked in her words. Jack grinned and replied without turning around, "You heard me. I'm not going to serve you personally. Go to another store. Grandma, you're certainly not welcome here." Rose pressed her lips together and felt her eyes begin to tingle slightly. She couldn't believe that she was being denied such a simple thing to buy bread and milk, as if her very presence here was enough to annoy anyone. Memories flashed through her mind of how she had already been rejected because of the color of her skin when she was young, rejected in schools, in cafes, at work, and how she had struggled with it all her life. But now she was almost 90, and in her heart she didn't understand why that old ghost had risen up before her again. Her anger intensified, becoming more than just resentment. It was as if something inside her, suppressed all these years, had suddenly burst forth. She lifted her head, her gaze meeting the eyes of several customers who, though silent, were clearly shocked by what was happening. Some of them looked as if they were ready to intervene, but something was holding them back. Jack felt it, too, and his face paled slightly, but he quickly pulled himself together, looking around at everyone with a cold grin. "You've heard it all," he threw again, as if wanting to humiliate Rose further. "Let her know she's not welcome. This is my store, and I decide who gets to shop here." Rose took a step backward. Looking at his face, she realized that she couldn't change his attitude with persuasion or pleading. He was too sure of his right to humiliate her, too convinced that he, his store, his family were all above her life, her rights, her human dignity. She was silent for a few seconds, and then, gathering all her courage, she said so loudly that her voice echoed throughout the store, "If you don't want to serve me, then you have no respect not only for me, but for everyone standing here. You're not only humiliating me, you're dishonoring yourself and your family. Your grandfather, Mr. Barker, respected all his customers. I knew him and I know he would never allow his customers to be treated like this." Jack was confused for a moment, but recovered immediately, snorting unhappily. "You're not forcing me to do anything. I do what I think is right, and my grandfather, if he were here, I don't think he'd care much. Things have changed. You understand?" She looked at him with sadness and deep disappointment, as if she had hoped to the last to see a modicum of respect, but found none. Barely holding back her tears, she turned to leave. Her heart felt heavy and empty. This day had shattered the world she believed in, the world where it seemed that people were able to overcome hatred and understand each other. Rose went to the door and, casting one last glance at the store, shook her head. "You're the unhappy one, young man. Only one person is unhappy here, and that's you." And, gathering up her old bag, she walked out, leaving behind her the emptiness and whispers of condemnation hanging in the air. When Rosa left the store, it was as if a silent fire had broken out among the remaining customers. Those who had just been silent witnesses now looked at each other, whispered, and their eyes were filled with emotions ranging from anger and embarrassment to cold indifference. The first to speak was an older woman with a short haircut and a determined look. She turned to Jack, who was now standing behind the cash register, and shook her head indignantly. "What was that all about, Jack?" she asked sharply. "Have you lost your mind? How could you talk to that old lady like that? She's a regular customer, and everyone knows Rose is a kind and decent woman." Jack, strangely enough, was not embarrassed. He even seemed to enjoy the uproar, as if his behavior only confirmed some inner rightness he had. "Listen, Mrs. Henderson," he looked haughtily at the woman, "this store is my territory. I decide who I associate with and how I interact here. If anyone doesn't like it, the doors are that way." He nodded toward the exit, showing indifference to everyone present. One young man standing by the refrigerators joined the conversation, looking at Jack with disdain. "You know, Jack, you're overdoing it. This isn't just your territory anymore. People come here to shop, they pay money to your family, and you treat them like garbage. Is that even normal?" Some of the other customers nodded in agreement, but there were others who looked at the young man with disapproval. One of the men, in his 50s, gaunt and sullen, said calmly but firmly, "Look, he has his reasons. Jack has every right to refuse anyone if he doesn't like something. We live in a free country, and he does as he sees fit." His words hung in the air, eliciting unhappy looks from the other shoppers, but the man seemed sure he was right. "What the hell are you even talking about?" almost shouted a woman with a basket that held only vegetables. Her voice shook with anger. "Since when is rudeness and outright disrespect of freedom? The whole neighborhood knows Rosa. She's a kind woman and should be treated with respect. She's almost 90 and you, Jack, treat her like she's nothing. It's disgusting." Jack, remaining unperturbed, shrugged, dropping his shoulders. "You don't know the whole truth. This woman may not be as saintly as you think. Don't make her a victim just because she's old and..." He hesitated for a moment, but then added, as if challenged, "and not like us." There was silence. These words had the effect of a bomb exploding. Now no one could contain their emotions. A young girl standing with a basket by the bread shelf exclaimed indignantly, "Not like us? What does that mean? Jack, don't you think it's racist?" She turned to the others. Can this be tolerated? This place is for all of us, for everyone in the neighborhood, and he treats the customers like dirt. And this is after all Rosa has done for this neighborhood. Someone from the far corner added, the indignation in his voice unmistakable. Rosa often helped out at the local church, organized fundraisers, and supported underprivileged children. She was a symbol of kindness and resilience for the entire neighborhood. But then the same older man who had defended Jack as if he had been entrusted with the store's defense stepped in again. You know, not everyone likes her, and that's okay, too. You don't need to turn the store into an arena for moralizing. Jack is the owner, and he has the right to choose who he wants to help and who he doesn't. Yes, of course you don't like someone of a different color or age. It's so vile. What if your mother had been treated like that? The elderly Mrs. Henderson threw back at him, squeezing her bags as if about to throw something at Jack or his protector. She stood beside the young girl, both of them looking indignant to the core, and their looks full of contempt. Tension was building between the customers. It seemed as if an open quarrel was about to break out. People whispered even louder, some of them looking at Jack with open contempt, and others lowering their eyes, not wanting to interfere. There was condemnation on everyone's faces, but few were willing to stand up for old Rose. Some probably didn't want trouble. Others were afraid of losing the good treatment of the shopkeepers. Finally, one middle-aged man, who had not uttered a word since the incident began, headed resolutely for the exit, quipping, I don't want to spend my money in a place where people are humiliated like this. Let them know that not everyone likes it here. Several other people followed him, shaking their heads in displeasure and muttering words of condemnation. Jack watched them leave with a wry grin, as if their opinions didn't matter to him. He remained behind the counter like an unshakable wall of indifference and cold contempt. He didn't seem to take the whole situation seriously. To him it was just a minor scandal that would soon be forgotten. His posture spoke of absolute confidence in his rightness, that he did not care about anyone's opinion. He saw before him a crowd of little people who could be easily ignored. But one thing he failed to notice was that the situation had left a deep imprint on the minds of his neighbors. As he left the store, people were whispering among themselves, discussing what had happened. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. The way Jack had treated Rose had shocked people, showed them that behind the familiar storefronts of their neighborhood there was something rotten, something that affected everyone. This day was more than just a store purchase for many. It was an encounter with something dark and unpleasant that was revealed to them in full. And each of those shoppers took that feeling with them, a sense of judgment, disappointment and, for some, awakening. When some of the customers left the store, still reeling from the shock, their indignation turned into discussion. They stood in a group at the entrance, talking in low tones. The anger and disappointment that had gripped them after the humiliating scene demanded an explanation. And, as always, old rumors began to surface amidst the low-key whispers. You know, I've heard about the Barker family somewhere before, began one of the men, about 45 years old, tall and stout, seeming to radiate indignation with every movement. Rumor has it that they've always had a less than, well, let's say, benevolent view of the likes of Rose. Their store has been in this place for a long time, back from the days when Jack's grandfather was the only one here, and he seemed like a normal guy, but he was selective about his circle. The woman with the short haircut standing next to her nodded, as if that knowledge too had long ago rested somewhere in the back of her mind. Yes, that's right. Jack's grandfather, Mr. Barker, was almost a legend around here, except that even then, it was said that he supported certain circles. Not everyone knew that, but those who did, remember it well. And when his son, Jack's father, took over, he wouldn't let anyone in but his own. And his mother, one of the people listening to the conversation asked quietly, I heard she wasn't very friendly to others either, especially after that incident a few years ago. At these words, the tension among those standing around increased, and someone in the group seemed to recall the incident. A couple of years ago in the same store there had been an unpleasant incident with a young black guy who, it was said, had tried to pay for the goods, but had faced humiliating treatment from Jack's father. The man apparently considered him a threat just because of his skin color and publicly declared that people of his kind don't belong here. The story quickly went viral, causing a wave of outrage, and many people then, as they do today, left the store in protest. But Jack and his father pretended as if nothing serious had happened, and after the incident there was a somber calm. But it's one thing for my father to do that, even though he was an adult. Mrs. Henderson said restrainedly, clutching her bag so tightly that her fingers turned white. And Jack, he's a young fellow. He's not even 30. You'd think that couldn't happen in this day and age. And who'd have thought there'd still be such hatred in this generation? But one of those standing, an elderly man with a wrinkled face, snickered, wrinkling his forehead unhappily. It's kind of not like that. It's all in the family, the way you're brought up. That's the way you live, no matter how old you get. His grandfather didn't tolerate those who were different, and his father considered himself superior to everyone else. So we have a generation where people like Jack think they can humiliate people by looking them in the eye and not even blush. The young girl, who had been silent until then, was nervously rubbing her bag and looking around anxiously. How could it be? We all thought these times were gone, that our society had changed. This isn't a small town somewhere out there, after all, but a decent neighborhood with people who have always tried to respect each other. I can't understand. Does he think he'll get away with this? He's definitely not going to get anything, the man in glasses threw in, shaking his head. They've always defended themselves, and who's going to try to do anything about it? It's like he's the only one here. We all know that not everyone here is as tolerant as they seem. These words hung in the air like a bitter truth that no one wanted to speak aloud. The silence made it clear to everyone that many had long suspected the underlying sentiments in the neighborhood, but had always hoped it didn't concern them personally, until they saw how blatantly and cruelly someone had been treated before their eyes. But how can it be so? Exploded suddenly one of the young men who were standing a little to the side. It's not like we can just walk out of here and forget. Rose is one of us. We all know her. Can't we leave her like this, humiliated? In tears, Mrs. Henderson squeezed his hand as if agreeing with his anger. You're right, son. We're all so used to thinking it's over. And it turns out it's right there, right under our noses, just waiting to rear its head again. We've got to do something. A shadow of determination spoke among those who remained. People looked at each other, and there seemed to be a growing realization that if they kept silent, they would become accomplices. Rumors about the Barker family, their special views and strange incidents in the store with strangers and the unwanted, had long been known, but each time they were only brought up out of necessity, convincing themselves that it was an accident. Now it had become something that could be felt, and one could no longer simply close one's eyes. As the crowd outside the store began to disperse, one of the customers, a young man with a serious face and quick eyes, took out his phone with determination and recorded what was happening. His recording showed Jack's clear voice speaking derogatory words to Rosa, and a scene in which other customers were clearly outraged and hurling accusations at him. He stared at his phone, determined not to let this fade into silence. A few minutes later, after writing the text of a post about the incident and adding hashtags like hashtag Rosa deserves respect and hashtag no racism, he published the video. When you live in the 21st century but racism is still as raw as it was 100 years ago, he wrote. The video quickly went viral on social media and began gaining views, and dozens of comments began appearing underneath it. Soon there were hundreds more. This is unthinkable. How can this even happen in our city? Fire him immediately, wrote one user. Who knows this family? Can you tell us where this store is located? We can't ignore it, demanded the girl, whose avatar was emblazoned with a call for equality. Serves him right, added another man, sharing his indignation. This poor woman doesn't deserve to be humiliated like this. Someone should intervene. The post continued to gain views. Local activists joined in, noticing the trend of discrimination messages and demanding that the store's management be held publicly accountable for their employees' behavior. The posts quickly began to garner hundreds of reactions, comments and reposts, and the video spread far beyond the neighborhood. Residents of the town began to unite. Some suggested holding a protest outside the store, organizing a collection of signatures for its closure, attracting the attention of the local press. Some shared their own stories about how they had faced rejection or prejudice in the same neighborhood, and soon numerous comments with personal stories of discrimination began to appear under the publication, recalling, among other things, other cases of unfair treatment in this very store. An elderly man who still remembered the old Mr. Barker wrote that it was his tough stance toward people he felt didn't belong in his circle that started the problems. This place is saturated with this attitude, he wrote, and I fear that until we show our disagreement, people like them will think everything is all right. Young people, seeing the post, were as angry as the adults. After seeing an old video of Jack humiliating Rose go viral, They began to unite in their accounts, calling on other users to fight against any inequality. The comments under the video were full of anger and bewilderment that this could even be happening. "That's it, I don't buy anything from them anymore," wrote one. "We should start a boycott of this store. Someone needs to stop this." Others cheered. A few hours later, the post hit the big pages, attracting the attention of local bloggers and activists. One prominent local journalist, known for his passionate stance on human rights issues, commented, "Shame and disgrace. The city should not have to put up with such overt racism. Where are the police? Where are the authorities? Where's justice?" A few hours later, the city council also noticed the video. Their account left a comment under the post: "We demand an immediate explanation from the store owners. This is unacceptable." The Barker family had owned the store for almost 3 generations, and in their neighborhood the name Barkers sounded respectful and cautious at the same time. Jack's grandfather, Mr. James Barker, was the founder of the store, starting with a small store on the outskirts. He gradually grew it into a full-fledged store, serving more and more families in the neighborhood. Mr. James Barker was always proud of his business, seeing it not just as a business, but as a contribution to a traditional society where everyone was just like him. The elder Barker made no secret of his views. He avoided hiring anyone who did not fit his ethos. Some neighbors repeatedly noted that Mr. Barker refused to serve people who looked suspicious to him, and most often they were minorities, whom he clearly did not pity. In his family, he was not shy about asserting his traditional stance, backing it up with verbose arguments about the order and purity of society. When it became difficult for James to run the store, his son, John Barker, Jack's father, came to the rescue. Having inherited his father's conservative views, John hardened them even further, and the shadow of his former prejudices seemed to have returned to the neighborhood. He openly despised those he called unacceptable elements and surrounded himself with a circle of like-minded people with whom he could safely discuss anything he considered a menace to society. In his eyes, each generation was becoming softer, moving further and further away from the ideals of a strong and pure society, and he was determined to change that. Telling Jack about their duty from an early age, he tried to foster the same prejudices in Jack by pouring his beliefs into his son, instilling in him the idea that some people simply didn't fit in. Father and son shared an almost friendly bond, where conversations on such topics became a regular part of life. When the time came, Jack, despite his youthful desire to break free from his father's intrusive attitudes, embraced the legacy himself. He began working in the store, seeing his father act arrogantly every day with those he considered outsiders and believing it to be the norm. In Jack's eyes, a certain image of the right person was formed, and if someone didn't fit that standard, there was no place for them in his life, as well as in the store. Jack's mother, Susan Barker, watched in silence as her husband and son reveled in their righteousness. She was not so adamant, but she did not intervene for fear of incurring her husband's wrath and destroying the illusion of family order. Occasionally, when she saw Jack humiliating a client or speaking harshly about someone, she tried to talk to him, urging him to be gentler, but each time she was rebuffed. Her husband considered such conversations unnecessary, calling them women's centimeters, so Susan remained in the shadows, becoming a silent spectator of her family's upbringing. Over the years, Jack had come to believe that their neighborhood and their store were their territory, where outsiders had no place. His friends, who also supported his family's views, often gathered at his house or store to discuss their vision of an ideal society. In their conversations, they blamed modern activists, changes in society, and laws that they felt were destroying the good old traditions. Jack listened to this and became more and more convinced that he was on the right side of history, and all he was doing was merely a defense against invasion. When Rosa, a person who didn't fit into any of Jack's ideas of a proper customer, everything that had been nurtured by his family over the years, spoke to him. Rosa sat on a bench outside her home, surrounded by friends and acquaintances, many of whom had gathered that day. People's eyes were on her with support and understanding as she shared her story, which she almost never shared in detail. Rosa tried to speak calmly, but her eyes betrayed the heaviness and pain, the pain she had carried throughout her life. She was born in a small southern town where her family had been humiliated and discriminated against for generations. Her father, a proud and strong man, worked all his life in a factory where wages were minimal and conditions unbearable. He had to work day and night to feed his children, but at the same time, every time he entered the local store, Everyone pretended as if they didn't notice him. People just looked away, like he was nothing, Rosa said, and for a moment her eyes drifted back to the days when, as a child, she saw how unfairly her father was treated. Rosa knew from childhood that her life would be full of challenges. As early as high school, she had to face constant ridicule. They called me different names and made fun of me just for the way I looked. The teachers always watched silently without intervening. They, like the students, thought it was the norm, she continued, her voice trembling. Later, becoming an adult, Rosa made a decision to leave her hometown and try her luck in a new place. She dreamed of a life without prejudice, but the move did not become a salvation. Once in the big city, she still faced resentment and coldness from coworkers and employers. I had to make my way everywhere I went. I remember getting a job at a hospital and every day the doctor on duty ignored me, didn't even say hello, as if I didn't even exist, she recounted, her voice harsher and her gaze harder. He said people like me couldn't be real nurses. I tried not to react, but inside I would break down every time because it seemed endless. Life seemed to test her over and over again, but Rosa did not give up. She still learned to survive in the world, became independent, strong and respected in her community. Through so much humiliation, she had developed grit, steadfastness, and a sense of self-worth that now shone through in every word she spoke. Today I have lived here in this neighborhood for over 20 years. I am friends with all the neighbors, their children and even their grandchildren. I've watched them grow up, and I know how much each of them loves me. I used to think that everything I've been through was behind me, she continued, her voice trembling slightly, but yesterday reminded me that the wounds haven't healed and that some people never change. I naively thought I could just be a customer, not deserving of humiliation like anyone else. She lowered her gaze, taking a deep breath. Silence hung among the listeners. Many of those present had known Rosa since childhood, but had never realized what she had been through. Her story shed light on the pain she had behind her smile, her desire to help everyone in the neighborhood. The video of Rosa's humiliation had already become a topic for news and heated discussions at all levels. In every corner of the neighborhood, people could not remain indifferent, discussing what had happened at work, in schools, and over family dinners. Gradually, a common understanding was forming that the Barker family store had no right to continue doing business while such contempt reigned on its doorstep. One of the first to call for action was Rosa's neighbor, Anne. Deeply moved by her friend's story and courage, she created an online petition demanding that the store owners fire Jack and publicly apologize to Rosa. Within days, that petition had garnered thousands of signatures. It was followed by calls for a boycott of the store. People who had previously been loyal to customers now refused once and for all to support a business built on disrespect. A crowd gathered outside the store on Saturday. People of all ages held placards that read "Justice for Rosa, a place for all, not a chosen few, and no to racism here and now." Emotions were running high. Many of the protesters saw Rosa as the mother and grandmother of the neighborhood, a woman who has always supported everyone, and now their goal was to support her. The crowd chanted, calling for the store owners to come out and explain themselves. No one could remain indifferent as elderly neighbors told how they had seen her difficult journey and how she deserved respect, not humiliation. Even children and teenagers joined the protest. Some held signs, some handed out flyers, some recorded videos to spread on social media, taking the story further. When the news reached local social justice journalists, they began to actively support the protest and brought it to the attention of more people. The story soon spread beyond the neighborhood to other cities where similar cases, though not always publicized, also caused discontent. On the third day of the protests, it became known that major suppliers who had learned of the incident suspended their cooperation with the Barker family store. The firms did not want to be associated with a company whose name had become a symbol of intolerance. Jack and his parents, accustomed to the stable support and trust of their suppliers, suddenly found themselves faced with the fact that their business was going under. Accounts began to empty, and signs on the doors of the store were increasingly showing shortages of goods that no one else wanted to deliver. Under pressure from the public and the appalling rate at which profits were falling, the Barker family eventually announced that they would hold a meeting to discuss the incident. Jack, with a grim expression on his face, stood beside his father and mother on the doorstep of the store, looking out at the gathered crowd. But it was clear now that it wasn't formal apologies or explanations that the community needed. People wanted to see real change, to understand that this kind of treatment wouldn't happen again. Rosa, surrounded by friends who had supported her since the first day, watched, her eyes a mixture of sadness and dignity. She knew that the struggle was just beginning, that one action would not change attitudes overnight, but seeing those around her who had refused to be silent for her sake, she felt she could find the strength to move on, hoping that their loud voices and determination would indeed bring the change she had waited a lifetime for. As Jack stood on the threshold of his store, his eyes darted around the crowd. He didn't know what to expect, how this would all play out. He'd been sure he was right before, but now he faced a reality full of anger and judgment. Thoughts of how easily he had disregarded Rosa's human dignity swirled through his mind, but it was only now, as the protesters made their stand loudly, that he began to realize the gravity of his actions. He came home that evening and the atmosphere in the family was overwhelming. The parents seemed distraught. His father, usually stern and confident in his views, looked tired, his eyes expressing not only concern about the business but fear for the future. "Do you realize what you've done?" he pronounced, his voice trembling. "You've not only set us up to fail, you've destroyed what we've been building for decades." Jack, no longer so sure of himself, felt his pride shrink for the first time in a long time. "I didn't mean for it to end this way. I didn't think it would," he said quietly, but his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He couldn't find the words to explain how he felt the moment he refused to serve Rose. It was wrong, but how could it have happened? At night, when the rest of the family had gone to their rooms, Jack was alone in his bedroom, staring at the ceiling. It occurred to him how he had always avoided talking about racial issues with his father. All those conversations had been tough, full of animosity toward those who didn't look like them. "I was just following family tradition," he thought, but that excuse now sounded as hollow as the tradition itself. Memories of his childhood years came to Jack's mind, of seeing his father reject people for the color of their skin, and of imitating him himself to earn his approval. But it wasn't always like that. There were times when he felt alone, when sincere friends at his school who weren't white tried to introduce him to other cultures. He was always dismissive of them, ashamed to be friends with them because he knew his father would disapprove. Jack couldn't sleep. He had witnessed his family and business fall apart, and suddenly his parents, who had always seemed adamant, looked vulnerable. He remembered how Rose would smile when she came into the store, how she was always willing to help the neighbors. She never asked for much, just looked for respect. Why didn't I see this before? The thoughts rolled like loud waves against the silence. The next morning he got up with a determination to change everything. He may not have been able to change his past, but he could try to change his future. He knew he had many challenges ahead of him, but he also realized that change begins with realizing his mistakes. The support he had once rejected was now his guiding light. Not knowing what to do, he decided to go to the society that had organized a protest in support of Rosa. He may not have known what to expect, but he realized that his actions needed to be corrected. He could either remain in the shadow of his family or he could become someone who would truly change his life and the lives of others. Gathering all his strength, he headed to the place where the activists were gathered. Each step toward the crowd was difficult, but Jack felt something change inside him. There was no more room for excuses. In that moment, he realized that he was facing the consequences of his actions, consequences that required not only forgiveness, but change. When Jack finally arrived at the place where the protesters were gathering, his heart was racing. He noticed many familiar faces, neighbors, classmates, even the parents of his friends. They weren't all here just to protest. They were all here for Rose. He inhaled deeply, trying to cope with the excitement. Suddenly, he saw her standing in the center of the crowd, surrounded by people supporting her. In that moment, he felt that his own problems had become insignificant compared to what she had been through. As he came closer, he tried to gather his thoughts. There were so many words he wanted to say, but they couldn't express what he really felt. Rose looked calm and confident, her warm expression testifying to a strength of spirit that he didn't seem to have. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here to protect what was important to her and to others. Jack pulled himself together and walked toward her, his heart pounding as if it were about to jump out of his chest. He didn't know how to begin, but when he saw the kind look in her eyes, he made up his mind. "Rose," he began, his voice trembling with excitement, "I've come to tell you that I'm really sorry for what happened. I don't understand how I could have done that to you. I was blind, and I hope you can forgive me." Rose was silent, her eyes scrutinizing him, trying to read his intentions. A storm of emotions unfolded inside her. She experienced joy that he had come, but she also realized that forgiveness wasn't just words, it was an action that took time and sincerity. "Jack, it was hard for me to hear you say that. I've dealt with racism and hatred all my life and your behavior was no exception," she said. Her voice was strong but there was sincerity in it. Jack nodded, lowering his eyes full of shame. "I don't understand how I could have done this. I grew up in an environment where such attitudes were the norm, but that doesn't excuse my actions. I want to understand. I want to learn how not to do it again." Rose looked at him and remembered her own journey, all those moments when she had to choose between hate and forgiveness. "I can tell you my story. Maybe it would help you understand what I've been through," she offered, her voice softer but still confident. They found a secluded place, away from the crowd, and Rosa began to talk. She shared memories of how her family struggled to survive in the face of severe discrimination, how her mother worked multiple jobs to feed the family, and how her father, despite constant humiliation, never stopped teaching her to respect herself and others. Every moment, every word she spoke was filled with passion and pain that she carried through life. Jack listened, his heart clenched with pity. He'd never realized how hard it was to just live when you were confronted with hate at every turn. Every story she told him about racial prejudice and inequality opened his eyes to a reality he'd never faced. He felt his own privilege turn into a burden, and it was hard. When Rose finished, Jack didn't know what to say. It was as if the weight he was carrying on his shoulders was suddenly lighter, but there was still a lot of emotion felt inside. "I don't know if I can ever redeem myself, but I want to try. I want to change myself, my life, and maybe help others realize that racism isn't just a word. It's the real pain I've caused you and others," he said, his voice sounding sincere. Rose nodded. "Forgiveness isn't an easy road, but I'm willing to give you a chance. If you're sincere, maybe together we can do something to change this society for the better." That moment was a turning point. Jack, who realized his mistake and was ready to change, and Rose, who decided to give reconciliation a chance, stood on the threshold of a new chapter, not only in their lives, but in the life of the whole community. It was the beginning of a journey full of challenges and opportunities, where they could fight together for a better future. The events that had unfolded over the past few weeks had created a wave of change in the lives of not only Rosa and Jack, but their entire neighborhood. Now that everyone knew about the incident, many people began to realize how important it was to openly discuss issues of racism and bias. This was not just a matter for one person. It concerned everyone, those who were aloof and withdrawn as well as those who were afraid to speak out against injustice. Rosa, despite her age and hardships, felt a renewed energy within her. She took on the role of a mentor for young people in the neighborhood, starting to hold meetings to discuss racial identity, the history of discrimination, and the importance of helping each other. She shared her stories, but no longer just to talk about the pain, but to inspire people to take action. Each meeting became more and more intense, bringing together not only Black residents but also people of different races and ethnicities. Rosa was proud that she could be part of a process that brought people together instead of dividing them. There was a spark of hope in her eyes when she saw young people showing interest and willingness to change. Jack, for his part, continued his inner work. He didn't know how easy it was to fix what had happened, but he realized that it was his responsibility to change his own social circle and seek a deeper understanding of others. He began attending meetings at a local center where social justice issues were discussed and looked for opportunities to contribute to community projects. He volunteered at neighborhood improvement events, actively doing his best to give back to the community. Every day he realized more and more how his old views had been shaped by the pressures of family and society. He realized that by holding on to old beliefs, he was not only refusing to accept others, but was also losing a part of himself. He now worked to become a true ally and friend to those who had previously been discriminated against. Ironically, their individual changes began to reverberate throughout the community. Rosa and Jack at one point even became partners in organizing large events, festivals where people could come together, share experiences and start a dialogue. Gradually, only shadows of hatred and prejudice remained, and kindness and understanding came after them. But the work was not over. They both knew that fighting racism and prejudice was an ongoing process that required effort and awareness. Every day was a new challenge, a new lesson. Every time someone looked at another person with distrust, it required revisiting and rethinking. Soon the local media began to notice changes in the community, and Rosa and Jack's story became known not only in their neighborhood, but beyond. Their combined efforts inspired other communities to take similar actions, and soon similar initiatives began across the country. They realized that their small community had become a symbol of change, a lesson for all. When they met again at the community center, discussing the upcoming event, Rose smiled and looked at Jack. "You know, every time I tell my story, I don't just do it for others, I do it for myself as well, to remember how important this journey is." Jack nodded. "And so do I. Every conversation, every action, is a chance to change something in and around me. I realize now that we're all connected, and when someone suffers, that suffering affects us all." Their conversation ended with laughter and plans for the future. Full of hope and mutual understanding, they realized that the fight against prejudice is not just the responsibility of one person, but the collective work of an entire community. A community where every person is able to raise their voice for truth and be heard. This story was not only a lesson for Rosa and Jack, but also for everyone who knew about it. People realized that it is important not only to condemn bias, but to actively work to eliminate it. In a world where hate, bias and fear still exist, they realized that strength lies in unity and in helping each other. And so, Rose and Jack's story ended, but their lessons lived on, inspiring a new generation to fight hate and build a world where there is room for everyone, regardless of color, race, or background. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.